mysterious. Invasive. Deadly. And annoying as hell.
Annoying little fuckers.
At least, that's the vibe I get from some of the other players I hang around in regards to the rival robots. While I personally quite like them, I'm not crazy enough to look at this, and this, and these, and think to myself,
This is fine. I'm okay with the events that are unfolding currently.
let's face it, these guys needed more time in the factory. Look, I've seen a lot of stuff regarding robots, and I've seen great gaming bots, and some that are not so great. The rivals, well, they need some work. A lot of work. I've no clue what Ghost Ship Games has planned for these guys, but I think it'd be fun to look at some ways to make them more fun and interesting, without making them needlessly straightforward. Because right now they're incredibly static. In their current form, they catch a lot of flack, and much of it is well-deserved. For example, 2 of the 3 turrets are pretty run-of-the-mill, the third is okay, I guess, and Shredders fall into the same trap as other Swarmer-type foes. And then we have Patrollers, and I have a bit of a bone to pick with those. So what I want to do is propose a sort of thought experiment. Assuming the rivals are here to stay, which as it currently stands they are, what would make them a better addition to DRG than they currently are right now? The first major thing I'd change with the rivals is how they respond to damage, which, as it currently stands, is practically non-existent. Compared to most other foes in the game, these things don't even flinch when shot. It makes sense, sort of, because they're soulless automatons. Yet, it also doesn't make sense from an enemy design perspective, because despite them being soulless automatons, they shouldn't be immovable. Like, even in the case of turrets, and other stationary foes still react to damage in some way. Looking at you, Spitballer. There's a pretty clear difference in damage feedback between the Season 1 rival units and pretty much every other foe. With the Glyphids, you can see spurts of green blood coming out, chunks of armor flying off, and they all visibly flinch when hit. Like, is there anything more satisfying than having a Gears of War style headshot that blows the enemy's head clean off? Look, Ma, no face. The rivals, on the other hand, only have minor sparks and bits and pieces of their armor texture that fly off as particles, but there's no visible damage that's done. This is really apparent when you turn the HP bars off. With the bugs, even though you can't see their HP being chipped away at, the fact that you can see armor break and blood spray is a visual tell that you're doing damage. Compare this to the Oppressor, whose armor is unbreakable and has a very visible blue-white spark effect, indicating that you're not only not doing damage to the bug underneath, but the armor is stopping your shots entirely without issue. It is, after all, unbreakable. So the first fix, then, is to make it clear that you're doing damage to the robots by having their armor break in sections. The Glyphid Praetorian is a great example of this in action. The second fix is how this applies to the robots as a whole. Breaking the armor is good damage feedback, but let's take it a step further. For this, I want to bring up 2 enemies that can be a major nuisance, or even a huge threat in some situations, but can be dealt with in ways that I think would suit the rivals quite well. Those being the Mactera Goo Bomber and the Brood Nexus. Let's start with the Goo Bomber. This thing has 2 main options for causing issues. One is a blob attack that does decent damage, but is slow and easy to avoid. The other is a goo bombing run, where the bug will fly in a straight line, creating lines of gunk that slow your movement to a crawl. You pop the 2 sacks on either side of the bug's body, and this will disable its ability. Its only other option will be the blob attack mentioned before. So what does this have to do with the rivals? Imagine for a moment that you could shoot any of the existing bots in some way, blow a part of them off, and have it disable one of their attacks or abilities. I'll explain how this would work for the Season 1 rival units in a moment, but that's the basis for this idea. The other is the Brood Nexus, and this one's easy. When you pop a Brood Nexus eye, it takes a nasty chunk of damage as a result. Now combine all three effects. Armor break, with weaker structure underneath, weak points that disable certain effects when broken, and weak points that, when destroyed, do extra damage to whatever they were a part of. With this, shooting the rivals anywhere will give more feedback that you're doing damage to them, and depending on what parts of them you destroy, different things can be made to occur and make them much more than bullet sponges that shoot back. The Repulsor Turret is by and large the easiest of the turrets to deal with, despite it projecting 3 shield walls that disrupt your positioning and block your shots. That's really all it does though. It's not a major threat on its own, and even in clusters, an experienced dwarf can easily path through their shield spam and break the phalanx. So, how do we improve this? The Repulsor Turret itself is built to keep you away, but when it fails to do this, nothing of note happens. Applying the Praetorian Goo Bomber Nexus combo idea from before will make its weak points even weaker, but will cover them with breakable armor. Once you've stripped away the armor and shot the weak points enough, they'll break off and deal extra damage to the turret and disable one of its 3 force field generators, ultimately reducing the amount of shields it sends out. Maybe we'll add on some explosion sounds and fire and sparks to make it more satisfying to do. While this would make them significantly more fragile, we'll give them one more ability that you can use to your advantage, if you're smart about it. If you get in close and fail to kill them quickly, they'll stop casting shields and start charging a large area burst. This wouldn't do a whole lot of damage on its own, but it would be a similar effect to the Armor and Hearthstone changing phases, in that it'll launch you a rather large distance, along with anyone else who happens to be standing nearby. Depending on the cavern layout, this could be inconsequential or hazardous, as you could get sent flying off of cliffs, into an approaching swarm, or any number of other proximity-based dangers that Hoxie's harbors. Being aware of where you're standing will help prevent any unfortunate falls this might cause. If you're quick and smart with your positioning, however, you can turn the Repulsor Turret into a means to rapidly traverse caverns with special powder-like velocity. And who said dwarves couldn't fly, right? The Burst Turret is probably the first rival turret that poses any real threat. It's got a proper range attack and is pretty sturdy for only being 1 dwarf high. Groups of these can saturate an area with plasma fire, which makes them particularly dangerous, almost on the level of a room full of spitballers with both the high ground and swarm for backup. It's a lot, usually. Beyond that, however, they're fairly uninteresting. They're a run-of-the-mill turret that track you only until they fire, and when they do, they send a stream of plasma bolts in a single direction. While projectile speed is a factor to consider, they're very much similar to Betsy in that they don't make any attempt to lead their shots. This means they usually miss as a result. Staying mobile helps a lot versus these. The way I change these are, once again, not really a benefit to the turret design itself, but it makes them more complex than simply being just another turret, which is what they are as of right now. We'll first apply the Praetorian Bomber Nexus combo, so the damage will start causing their armor plates to bust off in a shower of sparks and flame, exposing the fragile internals of the turret. Not only does this give more feedback that you're doing the damage to these things, it'll reward you with a chance to deal even more by hitting their internals and take them out quick. The heat vent on the top isn't a terribly hard target to hit, but the resulting damage boost it gives is rather lackluster, barring a few weapons with some high damage setups. Some of those don't even bother with weak points and will kill the turret no matter where you hit it. I'd end up making that vent destructible, allowing it to be blown off and removing the turret's ability to dump heat, turning it into a ticking time bomb. It'll become an environmental heat source instead, and it'll accumulate heat over time. Bugs running by will soon start catching fire, and before long, it too will explode from becoming a glorified space heater, spraying near molten metal in all directions and doing damage and heat to everyone nearby. The visual warning for this will be the turret glowing in a similar manner to the Leadstorm's barrels. Once that thing starts turning orange, you'd probably want to step back. I would also make the muzzle of the turret a weak point. Destroying this would reduce the amount of shots per burst and also deal heavy damage to the turret itself. On top of that, it would also start spouting smoke and fire as a visual tell. You know, that way you can see that it's on its last legs, so to speak. The sniper turret suffers from the same problems as the burst turret. It's generally an uninteresting enemy to fight. It's basically shoot it before it shoots you, but at the ranges this thing will acquire you at, that's not always how it's going to go. Couple that with the high projectile velocity, high damage, and splash, and you get a turret that's reasonably scary, but also somewhat annoying too. It's like if an acid spitter could lock onto you from 60 meters away, and then start spitting at you from just as far, with high velocity spit. Not great. My reworked version of the sniper turret would be all about precision, or at the very least dumb luck. It has two main weak points: the targeting arrays on either side of its head, and the main particle accelerator inside of the head. All of these would have incredibly low HP, and destroying them would severely hinder the sniper in a number of ways. Let's start with the targeting arrays. Destroying one of these will seriously mess with the sniper's IFF system, which will make it highly likely to lock onto other rival units in the area, or even the bugs, rather than you. Something in it makes it prioritize range targets, so if there's a ton of spitters on the walls or a spitballer nearby, it might be worth keeping the turret alive to take advantage of its confusion. Of course, if it's just you and the turret in that cave, you're probably going to discover a laser aimed squarely at your forehead. This is where breaking the second targeting array comes in. When destroyed, the sniper turret's head movement is drastically slowed, moving at nearly half the rate it did before. This gives you plenty of room to avoid it and get more shots in before you have to move, or before it dies, whichever comes first. The particle accelerator inside the head is an insanely small target, and due to the high power of the shot it's meant to create, exists in a delicate balance that really should not be disturbed. Which means you absolutely should disturb it. This would probably be the hardest shot to intentionally hit in the game, as you'd have to thread a bullet straight down the barrel of the turret, though certain high-fire weapons could probably pull it off through sheer volume of fire. What does destroying the particle accelerator net you? Well, it ensures the sniper has fired its last shot, that's for sure. Without it, the thing can't focus all that plasma into anything even remotely resembling a projectile. It'll end up doing colossal damage to the head when it tries to fire, usually blowing it clean off. It's like that old Markspeck's tale about shooting a round down through an enemy sniper's scope and into his eye. Unlikely? For sure. Satisfying to pull off? Hell yeah. Now if only these things had scopes and eyes. Huh. From my perspective, the Shredders don't really have all that much wrong with them on their own. Instead, they end up falling into the same traps that Swarmers and NATO sites do. They're small targets, they're always in packs, and they fly. They also hit pretty hard, and that doesn't really help. It's like jellyfish plus lethal enemies, or at least it often feels that way. They also move through you when they attack, which can make tracking them a little more work than other foes who tend to move around you or stand still. At least they don't stun you. Thank the gods. Reworking the Shredder was tough, but I think I managed to come up with some ways to make them less of a pest and more of a help. If you let them, that is. The first and biggest change I'd make to them is to have them be a lot less focused on you specifically. The reason would be is that these drones are built to get in close with high defense foes and find the chinks in their armor, and then exploit it. When faced with you, a swarm of drones, a few Praetorians, and an oppressor or two, they're going to attack the oppressors first. Then they'll kill the Praetorians, and then they'll start working on clearing out the grunts. Only when there are no other melee-focused targets will they finally turn on you. The goal here is to make Shredders the most predictable and robot-like of the rivals. They're too small to house any sort of advanced AI, so they have very strict target priorities, which just so happen to align with yours, mostly. After all, a grunt that swallows a Shredder is going to have a pretty bad stomachache after the fact, right? Them behaving this way would also give you and your team a choice. With Shredders now more focused on the same bugs that really want you dead, do you kill them while they're distracted? Do you let them soften up the swarm first? Do you wait until they've turned on you and then kill them? Depending on how the mission is going and what your team comp looks like, you can turn these enemies into friends, at least temporarily. And if there are Mectera, Spitters, or any other ranged bug in the area, you might not even have to deal with them yourself at all. As far as you versus the Shredders is concerned, not much would be changed. All I do is give them a volatile death center effect, where when a Shredder goes down, it explodes like a small grenade, which will do area damage and potentially bring the whole flock down with them in a pretty flashy chain reaction. Obviously this would be a problem if they get too close to you, so I'd make them a little bit slower to make them easier to get away from. On top of that, if you hit them with your pickaxe, they won't explode at all. It probably goes without saying, but be careful firing on these if they're close to your team. My version of the Shredders would still be a threat, but at least you're the last thing on their hit list. You. Yes, you. You're like the whole crux of this thing, aren't you? You're tanky, you're slippery, you hit really hard, all while not reacting to damage and showing up with enough friends to compound your issues into a whole mess, don't you? Huh. I wonder why that seems so familiar. I'm sure it'll come to me. The patrol bot really is the main rival unit, and it shows, what with it having a whole loadout all of its own for you to deal with. Thankfully, its complexity means there's tons of room for interactability and improvement. Without spending too much time on it, it has a laser attack, a homing missile salvo, and a melee tackle. It's almost always on the move, it can transition between flying and rolling along the ground. It's worth noting that if you do bring it down, there's a chance that it'll only be disabled, becoming hackable. Once hacked, it turns its main gun on the bugs as well as other rival units, which makes it a great distraction as well as solid fire support. It's easily the most dynamic non-boss enemy in the game, and yet it still feels rather stale and isn't all that fun to fight. I think a large part of this is that the Patroller combines a lot of previously exclusive abilities into one really nasty package, like being able to move and shoot at the same time, in tandem with the rivals all being unresponsive to the player's actions against them. You know, I'd say shooting these things is as much fun as shooting a wall, but honestly, I think shooting the wall might be more fun than shooting these things. So let's change that. Remember that list of flaws I led the section with? We'll start there. First off, tankiness. These things are bullet sponges for sure, but by adding in breakable armor and underlying weak points, it's not going to be quite as resilient overall. Just like the others, we'll give it the Praetorian Bomber Nexus treatment, making its outer shell breakable. And in doing so, we'll expose the bot's internals, which can be damaged to change how the bot itself behaves. The first thing of note is a way to simultaneously make it less dangerous and slow it down. Breaking the armor off the bot's legs would expose the rocket launcher behind it. Destroying it will permanently reduce the amount of rockets fired per salvo, per leg. Whoever it was in the rival's design team that decided putting a propulsion system right beneath a rocket pod was a good idea probably should be canned. Blowing up the rocket pod would also damage the stabilizer, and as a result, the bot's speed will permanently be reduced for each stabilizer it loses, doing a pretty good chunk of damage just to add insult to injury. If you destroy all four, it'll guarantee the bot's demise. Next, it's Rolling Tackle. This one's a doozy because it can go through gunner shields and in general has the same effect as a Corona, Youngling, or Shellback, except it can also fire on you in the process. You could say that it has a mini Shellback. So the key here is to strip the armor from the ball and then destroy it. Without the ball, the bot must stay airborne. Last but most certainly not least, it's lasers. Like the normal patrol bot, the head would be the primary weak point still, fully lacking armor and also housing its primary offensive weapon. Unlike the patrol bot, however, attacking it here would do even more damage. And if the shot to destroy the bot happens to be dealt to its head, then there's a guaranteed chance that the bot will be hackable. On top of that, when hacked, it will use any abilities it still has access to, rather than simply floating around and shooting its primary weapon. This means if you hack it before you've destroyed the rocket launchers or its ball, it'll be able to do massive damage to swarms of glyphids by raining missiles down and charging through them, as well as blasting them with its laser. What I'm going for here is to give players more impact on the patroller, rather than being forced to engage a bullet-spongy enemy with no options. A patroller that works like the one I've laid out here gives you the choice to disable its offensive systems, or aim for the weak point and get a powerful, if temporary, ally. It's about the player actively trying for a certain outcome, rather than relying on random chance. Hitting the head is harder than destroying the armor and blowing it to pieces, but it'll yield more for your effort. Now if only all this were the bot we actually got. I think it goes without saying that these reworks to the Season 1 rival units, excluding the Prospector and Caretaker, make them at the very least more interesting than the bland, bullet-spongy rivals that we actually ended up with. They'd not only be easier to kill, but would have various new effects that the player has influence on, something we've seen with some of the other bugs. Hopefully we get to see them more fleshed out by GSG in the future, but for now, the rivals are stuck in their current, rather static state. This is just my thoughts on how I'd rework the rivals if I were able to. Like a more focused, what I'd love to see in DRG sort of thing. A fun thought experiment, taking into account criticism I've heard from the DRG community about the rivals as well as ideas of my own. I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on this too. Did you like my ideas? And do you have any of your own? Let me know in the comment section down below. I also want to extend a huge thank you to Drilling in the Nemo for the inspiration. His video talking through all the stats and details of the rivals as well as ideas for improving them was what got me started, and made me want to take it to the next level. Thanks also goes out to Sirvent, who's been a major inspiration as well. To everyone else, thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed. And until the next time, remember, keep your core strong, your eyes bright, and rock and stone. Gaze out.